Our next talk is from JacobKaplan-Moss. There's too many hyphenated surnames and I nearly stuffed that up. Jacob is the co-BDFL of Django and a partner at Revolution Systems, where he provides support services around Django and related open source technologies. He also worked where Django was born at World Online. So today he's going to talk to us about Django 1.5 and porting applications to Python 3. Please make him welcome.
Hey y'all, so I am JacobKaplan-Moss. On top of the other things that were graciously listed in my bio, I thought I should briefly mention that I've recently switched jobs. I'm now the also the director of security at Heroku. So among the many other hats that I'm wearing, I now add a Heroku hat on top of that. So if anyone wants to talk about Heroku, you can come find me. Although I'll probably just tell you to go talk to Kenneth because he's our Python guy and he knows all that stuff. All right, and that's all I'm going to say about my employer. That's the obligatory, plug. Let's get into it. Okay, so Django 1.5 shipped roughly 6 months ago, and it was a big deal. We had Python 3 support. We announced that Django 1.5 supports Python 3, and we said, okay, everything's ready, it's in place, you can start porting your apps. Django 1.6 is on track to ship in August, and 1.6 is really like our official, we really think we're ready. We kind of hedged our bets a bit with 1.5. We called our support for Python 3 experimental. The idea being we wanted to give ourselves some leeway if we needed to make any last-minute changes, if we discovered issues with our approach. We wanted to give ourselves some freedom to break things if we needed to break things. Turns out we actually got it right on the first try, which is kind of surprising. And so as of 1.6, we're basically declaring Python 3 support stable. We're saying it's ready for production, you can use it in production, go to town. So this talk is about that, is about our support for Python 3, about what that means for you, and about how you can go about taking advantage of Python 3. So before we start talking about the how, there's some sort of natural questions that are going to come up. And I think the first one from most people who've been using Python for any period of time is, okay, but do I actually want to use Python 3? Is this Python 3 thing actually a thing? Do I want to use it, or is it just like Perl 6, this kind of joke that's out there that never is going to actually come to fruition? And actually, yeah, if you like Python, you'll love Python 3. Really, all those little things that annoy you about Python? The fact that print is a statement, so you can't rebind print to log, and if you put print statements in code, they go to the console, and you can't somehow magically make that go out to a log file. Well, that's fixed in Python 3. The syntax for super, that obnoxious super class comma self, did I get that right? Whatever it is, fixed in Python 3. I could go on. Python 3 is basically Python 2 with all the annoying parts gone. It's hard to explain just how nice it is to write code in Python 3. It's surprisingly pleasant. You sort of have, if you've been doing Python for a long time, you've internalized all of these annoyances, all of these warts, all of these issues. And then when suddenly they're not there anymore, it's so nice. Python 3 is way more pleasant than Python 2. And the biggest thing, though, the thing that really tips it over the balance for us, for web developers, is that in Python 3, Unicode is actually a thing. It actually works right. And this is really amazing, right? We don't live in a world where English is the only language that our applications need to support. We don't live in a world where 8-bit ASCII is sufficient to represent every single name of every single one of our users. And in Python 2, actually dealing with real-world data, dealing with character sets other than ASCII, starts to just make your head explode. Django papers over some of those issues for you and makes it a little bit easier to deal with, but sooner or later, you're going to be woken up in the middle of the night with an error message from Sentry and a Unicode decode error. And you're going to spend a ton of time trying to trace it down. I see heads nodding. You know what I'm talking about. In Python 3, this basically doesn't happen. Python 3 really tightens up the rules around how Unicode is used and represented, and as a result, if your tests pass, your code will work with any character set. It basically pushes the burden of dealing with Unicode issues to a sort of programmer time constraint, something that comes up early on in development rather than later. It's a basic tenet of programming, right? You want to fail early. You don't want something that fails once it's in production, once it's been running for a while, and that forces you to debug through some weird data. And Python 3 finally gets that right. It's totally fantastic, and it revolutionizes the way that your application deals with sort of international data. Okay, so that's the do you want to use Python 3? The more difficult question is, can you use Python 3? There's good news and there's bad news in this sphere. The good news is that the Python community is moving a lot quicker now towards a world where Python 3 is supported everywhere. And that's because of some of the techniques that I'll talk about in a little bit. But there's also some bad news, which is that not everything's there yet. The real question about can you use Python 3, the real practical question, basically comes down to a question of dependencies. If your application's dependencies have been ported, then you can use Python 3, and you should. But if they haven't, then you have to do a sort of complicated calculus of, okay, well, can I switch dependencies and use something else instead? Can I take the time as part of my development effort to port something else to Python 3? Or do I just have to kind of throw up my hands and use Python 2? So let me go through some of the big dependencies and talk about the current state, where we are right now in terms of Python 3 support. So the first big problem that you're going to face when you run into Python 3 is your choice of databases and whether or not your database is supported by Python 3 or by Django together. So if you use Postgres, you're fine. And we all use Postgres, so I'm just going to move on, right? Seriously, just switch to Postgres. You'll be so much happier. SQLite works. MySQL is kind of in a weird state. There is a Python 3 compatible MySQL connector binary that Oracle puts out, but there are licensing concerns. I'm not going to shave that yak here on stage. Come talk to me later if you're interested about the state of the art here. But basically, as it stands, we, the Django sort of core committers, cannot recommend that you use Oracle's MySQL connector in your application. It may work, and you may want to try it if MySQL is a hard requirement, but we can't recommend that you do that because of some licensing concerns on our end. And if you're a nerd and want to talk more about that, you can find me afterwards. And I don't actually know the state of Oracle support. I do know that CX Oracle, the Python binder, has been ported to Python 3. Our CI server doesn't yet run Django's tests against Oracle and Python 3, so I can't give you hard data on that. I believe that it works, at least as well as Python 2 support does, but I'm not 100% sure there, so I've put the little question mark there. So, depending on what database you're using and depending on your flexibility in switching databases, you may or may not be able to use Python 3. Once you've answered that question, you'll probably want to be talking about deployment. The good news is that you have a lot of good options when it comes to deployment. The bad news is that the most popular option, which is Gunicorn and gEvent, at least that's what seems to me from sort of surveying what people are doing out there, doesn't really work that well. There's a Python 3 branch of gEvent, but it's been unstable in my testing. However, ModWSGI has supported Python 3 for a long time, since before we did, and UWSGI also works on Python 3. And for low traffic, the Gunicorn sync workers, which are actually surprisingly fast, work pretty well. So you've got sort of 2.5 really good choices for deployment under Python 3. You may have to, the first site that I ported, I had to switch from using Gunicorn to ModWSGI. slightly more work in terms of setup. Now you got to run Apache, but in terms of performance, it seems to run about the same. So you won't have anything performance-wise holding you back. You may have to switch to a different tool if your preferred tool is not yet supported. And the situation with Gunnicorn is sort of changing rapidly. It may be the case that, even by the time this conference is over, it now works. So, watch that space. So next, I took a look at some popular Django third-party packages. These are roughly the top 10 most popular third-party packages according to downloads from PyPy, which is kind of a not the best metric, but an okay one. And I monkeyed with it a little bit just to make this list be roughly what I think people are actually using. So if you've written an existing Django site, you probably see stuff that you're using on this list. So some good news and some bad news again. A lot of the big stuff, South, done. Celery, done. Raven, which is the client part that hooks up to the Sentry error reporter, done. But some bad news. Django compressor is not ported. Django social auth isn't ported. Some older stuff. I mean, Django tagging hasn't had an update since 2009, so that's probably not going to get ported. So it's a mixed bag when you go to evaluate your application's third-party dependencies. But again, there's also some good news here, which is that in a lot of cases, there are suitable alternatives. So there's no Django compressor, but there is Django pipeline. And in fact, Django pipeline is better than Django compressor in a lot of ways. So even if you're using Python 2, you may want to be upgrading to pipeline. And there's no social auth, but Django all auth has been supported. And for the most part, they are functionally equivalent. And there's no Django tagging, but Django tagit has been ported. And for the most part, they are functionally equivalent. So this is sort of a microcosm of your entire application's dependencies. When you sit down to start thinking about developing a new site, or if you're porting an existing one, or if you're thinking about the steps of moving to Python 3, you'll sort of have to play a game like this, right? Where you go, okay, I usually use Django registration for use in my site. So, okay, so Django registration doesn't exist on Python 3 yet. Does that mean I'm totally boned? Do I have to switch back to Python 2? Maybe that's a deal breaker. Is there a suitable alternative, right? Can I switch from compressor to pipeline? Do I have a lot of code invested in that dependency, or is that just something I'm using? I can just learn some new commands, change my deployment scripts, done. Or maybe, Django registration looks pretty small, looks pretty lightweight. Maybe you could just port it. Maybe you could do a service to the entire community, take a little extra time as part of your project, and get that ported. So every time I've done work with Python 3, I've sort of had to play this little game of dependencies. Look through my list, decide, is this something I absolutely need, and so it derails the whole project? Is this something I can port? Is this something I can replace? Is this something I can roll my own? Kind of this sort of complicated calculus. So we're not quite there at the point where I can just definitively say, oh yeah, Python 3, it works. But I think, as you can see, most of the things that you want to do, most of the things that you need are there for you waiting on Python 3. Of this list, I think that Django debug toolbar is probably the tool that I miss the most that doesn't run on Python 3 yet. There hasn't been a lot of things that I've run into lately that I've really gone, oh man, I really wish that I had this on Python 3. In almost every case, there's either the tool is ported or there's a suitable alternative, something I can use instead. And in many cases, the situation is as it is for Taggit or Pipeline, where the tool that you used to be using kind of isn't maintained that much anymore, and that's why it hasn't been ported to Python 3. Right? Compressor, essentially the reason there's no version of compressor for Python 3 is because Yannis, the creator of Django compressor, thinks that Django pipeline is better and would rather that you use Django pipeline. So there's not a lot of motivation in porting a tool that kind of has a better alternative out there. So in a lot of cases, that's the situation where the thing that's on Python 3 is the more modern, is the more up-to-date, is the more sort of the better tool. Okay, so we've answered the why, we've answered the can you. So there's really a question, though, of should you use Python 3? You know, given all this information, how do you make the decision whether or not you should use Python 3? And this is obviously a sort of complicated decision. There's some business issues here. As we'll see in a little bit, there's probably an additional cost to using Python 3, either in terms of development time or in terms of strictly in terms of money as it translates to effort. So can you stomach that extra cost? There's a productivity cost, right? You have to learn what's new in Python 3. There's also a productivity benefit, as you don't have to spend time tearing your hair out over Unicode issues. So there's sort of a cost-benefit analysis, a trade-off here. I can't give you a single piece of advice answer to this question because it's going to depend on your situation, on your application, on your company, on your particular needs. The best advice that I can give you here is to use Python 3 if you can, and to use Python 2 if you must. Python 2 is still a very good language, and it's going to be supported for a very long time, but it is a dead end. It is not going to get better. It's going to stay the way it is for 20 more years as it slowly dies off. Python 3, on the other hand, will get better. It will get faster, it will gain new features, it will get new external modules. Sooner or later, really awesome third-party community stuff is going to start showing up that only works on Python 3. Eventually, at some point in the future, Django will only work on Python 3. There's really no future to Python 2. It is, as Alex said a little while ago, Python 2 is the next COBOL. It's going the way of the dinosaur, slowly, and it might take 20 years, may even be optimistically fast. It's going to be a very, very slow ramp down, and there's going to be a very long support window. I mean, Red Hat has committed to supporting Python 2 until something like 2030. I mean, it's a long ramp down, and no one should be feeling scared about even starting new businesses based around Python 2 right now. But you should be cognizant of the fact that it is not a language with a future. So, you've made the decision to use Python 3. So now let's talk about the details, how you actually go about that. There's basically three choices you have in terms of how you go about writing a site using Python 3. You can write a site that supports Python 3 only. So this is the case if you're doing greenfields development, right? You're doing a brand new site. You have no real dependencies to speak of. You're not porting existing code. You're just starting from scratch. You don't need to support Python 2 because it's a brand new site. If you do have code that needs to support both Python 2 and Python 3, that's actually possible. And there's two different ways of doing that. One of them is called 2 to 3, and the other is a technique sometimes called shared source or single code base, or I don't know that we have a good single name for the technique yet. So let's talk about these options a little bit. If you can, do Python 3 only. If you're doing a brand new site, there's no reason to support both Python 2 and Python 3. If you're developing some awesome new third-party app, and you don't particularly care about making it available to Python 2 users, go right ahead and just support Python 3. At this point, there's nothing wrong with just supporting Python 3. You don't really need to hedge your bets there. If you are embarking on a new site and you get months in and realize that you have to fall back to Python 2, as we'll see when we talk about the shared source technique, it's actually not that hard to write code that runs on both. So if you guess and go Python 3 only and you're wrong, the cost of sort of taking that code and making it also work on Python 2 is going to be reasonably low. So if you're doing a new site and you want to use Python 3, don't even bother with trying to support both versions. Just start with Python 3 and go as long as you can with Python 3 support, and you'll probably get to production. If you do need to support both code bases, and this is mostly the case in apps, in pluggable apps that you're writing, that you need to support sites both written in Python 2 and written in Python 3, then you need a tool or a technique to help you with that. So the old tool, the initial thing that shipped with Python 3, the first version of Python 3, was a tool called 2 to 3. And 2 to 3 is actually like incredibly cool from a technology standpoint. It basically breaks your Python 2 code down into a syntax tree, and then does this pattern matching stuff, and then applies transforms to it, and you end up with a patch that converts your Python 2 code to Python 3. And it's like, the technology is really nifty. It's really super cool. But unfortunately, what you end up with is two separate code bases. You end up with a Python 2 code base that you run through a translator to get a Python 3 code base. And this has some pretty serious problems. The biggest one being around patch process and bugs. If you find a bug in the Python 3 version, you can't, and the patch, you come up to fix it, you can't just apply that patch because the original source code is actually in Python 2. So you have to do this weird thing where you find a bug in Python 3, you fix it in Python 2, you translate the source code and verify that the bug is fixed. And if it's not, you have to kind of like do this circular loop again. It's especially death to community contribution, because if Django used this technique and someone came to us with a patch that was written against Python 3, we'd have to say, no, go away and write it against Python 2. And it basically guarantees that you will be the last person writing Python 2. Because as long as you have one user who's still using Python 2, you need to keep writing Python 2 code and using 2 to 3 to translate it. So when the Django team evaluated 2 to 3 on any number of times, we basically kept saying, no, we want to write Python 3. We don't want to be the last people on earth writing Python 2 just because we still have some Python 2 supporters, Python 2 users. Luckily, a new technique emerged in the last few years. And this is what sometimes is called a single source approach. And what you do with this approach is you have one code base, you write code that is basically Python 3 code with a couple of little shims to ensure that it also works on Python 2. And this was made possible through some improvements in Python 2 itself, and also in some third-party libraries, and also just sort of a general recognition that it's actually possible to write code that runs on both Python 2 and on Python 3. And this approach really wins. You're writing Python 3 code. You, as the primary author, get to start writing Python 3, even if some of your users are still using Python 2, right? When we say that Django 1.5 supports Python 3, what we mean is we're actually writing Python 3, right? Django's source code has been in Python 3 for a year, roughly. We've all already been writing Python 3 for a year. If you're using Django 1.5 on Python 2, you're actually running Python 3 code, just with a couple of these little tricks and shims and bits to make it work back on Python 2. So we've actually been sneaking Python 3 onto your computers for a year now. So how does this technique actually work? This is the tool you should use. Let me walk through how it works. So I'll give you a couple of different examples of how I ported a couple of sites to Python 3. So briefly, the outline is you'll want to choose an approach. Are you going to go Python 3 only, or are you going to do the shared source technique? You'll need to evaluate your dependencies, and we've talked about this a bit. At this point, you've got code that you're ready to start writing. So the next step is to get your tests working. I hate to say it, but if you don't have tests, this whole thing goes right out the window, because the only way to really be sure that your code is going to work on both browsers is to be on both VMs, is to be able to test it continuously. And without a test suite, it's almost impossible to sort of work on this task iteratively. So a prerequisite to running code, to porting code to Python 3 is a good test suite. Usually, as soon as you get the test suite running, it will reveal that you have Unicode issues. If you've been writing Python 2 for any period of time, you've internalized Python 2's stupid, crappy rules around Unicode handling, and you're doing things you shouldn't be doing. Your code is probably unclean, and it's not your fault, it's Python's fault for having a fundamentally broken model. But what's going to happen when you get your test suite running is you're going to see all of these Unicode decode errors suddenly flooding out when you run your test suite. And each of these is representing a potential production bug that you haven't hit yet. So at this point, you can just kind of iterate on these test failures. Fix them one at a time until you finally have all your tests passing. And as we all know, when your tests pass, that means that your code works, right? Yes. I've left out the part where you deploy it and do QA and all of that stuff. Okay, so a couple of case studies. So the first study was a brand new website. RevSys, my consulting company, was hired by the PSF to build the new Python.org. So this was a natural candidate to be built in Python 3. And we sort of did a brief evaluation to figure out whether we could write it in Python 3, decided we could, and kind of went forward writing it in Python 3. Since then, we've done written a couple other sites in Python 3, but this is a good example for a couple of reasons. So we only needed to be Python 3 compatible. We didn't need to support Python 2. Like I said earlier, we weren't 100% sure that we could do Python 3 only. We weren't sure we weren't going to run into some dependencies that we really needed to get the job done. Obviously, the PSF is willing to let us spend a little extra time because Python 3 is a big win for them. But if Python 3 represented double the development time, that probably wouldn't be worth it even for them. Right? So there's a trade-off there, and we needed to be reasonably confident that we could be able to get a Python 3 site out in roughly the amount of time it would take us to do a Python 2 site. But we didn't really sacrifice that by choosing Python 3 only. If we had been wrong at some point down the line, it would have been just a couple days of work at most to switch back to Python 2. So we chose Python 3, and specifically we chose Python 3.3. If you're going to be using Python 3, you want to use Python 3.3. There's really not a good reason to use an earlier version of Python 3. There's not any backwards compatibility stuff. There's not code that doesn't yet support Python 3. This is enough of a bleeding edge that you might as well be on the latest thing. So then we sat down and thought about what our dependencies were for this site. It's a lot of static-ish content, so we had some CMS capabilities. It would have been nice to be able to use something like Django CMS or Find CMS or one of the other sort of CMS packages out there, just from a leveraging reuse category, but none of those worked on Python 3 yet. After sort of looking at it a little bit, we decided, our definition of CMS is pretty light. We don't need a lot of the more advanced features that these tools and frameworks provide, so we're okay rolling our own. This will cost a little bit more, but it's not going to be that big in the lifespan of the project. We had a moderately complex sort of user permissions authentication system, and this actually ends up being a point in favor of Python 3 because it meant we couldn't use any of the out-of-the-box more advanced permission systems for Django. We had sort of very domain-specific issues around the way we need to manage things like the Python job board has some very specific workflow and permissions requirements around it, and no existing system would have provided us with that, so we were going to have to write something from scratch anyway. We did want, in the spec, we had some pretty heavy integration with social network sites. One of the features of the site is that we want to kind of pull in all of the Python community's social activity, whether that's from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, whatever. Bring it all in, ingest it, and make the site be sort of a clearinghouse for what the Python community is doing. This was sort of the biggest point of friction between whether we could use Python 3 or whether we would have to use Python 2, because at the time we started, none of the sort of social login tools had been ported to Python 3 yet. The tool we were most familiar with at the time was Django Social Auth, but that wasn't ported, and none of the other tools we evaluated were. So we kind of crossed our fingers and started work on other features and started bugging people to help us port the other tools. And hey, it worked. The maintainer of Django AllAuth saw me give a similar talk to this at PyCon US and went and ported Django AllAuth during the sprint. So this gives you a rough idea of how much effort's involved in porting an app, by the way. He did it in 4 days, right? It's actually not that much work. So now we had this taken care of. And finally, we knew that we didn't have really severe traffic requirements. Python.org is going to kind of get traffic spikes when like new releases come out, when maybe there's some piece of news, I don't know. You get sort of linked up on Hacker News from time to time, but for the most part, the traffic's a sort of a pretty dull roar. This was important for us to determine because we needed to know that we could sort of deploy this thing, right? So we actually did a couple of experiments with Gunicorn, which is how we determined the G event wasn't fully baked yet. That was a shame. That's the tool we know the most about scaling. But we also know a lot about mod WSGI, and that worked well, and so we were good to go there. So if you're setting out to develop a site from scratch, this is the type of thing that you'll probably want to sit down and do to determine if you want to use Python 3. You'll want to go through your rough requirements, determine where your friction points are going to be, and maybe spend a little bit of time. All told, I think we spent about a couple of days sort of experimenting and playing around and determining whether Python 3 was an option for us. So in terms of time budget, you can see we've sort of already added a little extra time on top of our process just in terms of determining whether this was something we wanted to do. Okay, next step, start writing tests. Luckily, Django Discover Runner works on Python 3. And actually, this is soon to be moot because the test runner in Django 1.6 is Django Discover Runner, or functionally the same. So we didn't have to learn how to write tests using a different way. I know that both Nose and PyTest run on Python 3. I'm right about PyTest, right, Alex? Yeah. I don't know about the Django bits, but I think that they do. So probably whatever you normally use to write tests has already been ported. If it's not, the new thing in Django 1.6 is pretty nice. You might want to give it a shot. The hardest part about writing this new site was retraining our Unicode our Unicode muscles and learning how to do things sort of the Python 3 way, learning to think like a Python 3 programmer when it comes to Unicode. And I'll talk more about this in the second part when I talk specifically about fixing some of the bugs. Though I will mention one thing. So the biggest thing you can do to start thinking about Unicode correctly is to eliminate the word string from your lexicon. And I know that this is really hard, but if you start thinking about Unicode as having, if you're thinking about string things in Python as having two different types, bytes and text. Bytes are like raw data coming over a network. It might be human readable, it might be gzipped, it might be static, you don't know, it's just bytes. They're just streams of bytes. You can't really reason about, you can't talk about like a name in bytes because it's just bytes. There's no structure to it, it's just bytes. On the other hand, you also have text, and text is human readable. And in order to be human readable, it has to be readable by some human. So text could be in Roman text, it could be Japanese text, it could be Unicode Snowman, it could be any sort of, human readable text that we can talk about. And if you take a look at Django utils encoding, which is sort of the Django toolbox for dealing with encoding inside Django apps, you'll notice that we don't really use the word string in there very much. We tend to use bytes and text quite a bit. And if you start putting that in your mind now, start adopting that and thinking about all your data as either bytes or as text, you'll be in a very good shape for working on Python 3. That was the big thing that we had to do as we started reasoning about writing this site in Python 3, is to sort of retrain our brains to think about text in a new, in the sort of new, more correct Python 3 way. So the good news is that it worked. We have a site out. You can see the sort of preview version at preview.python.org. And this is going to be launching as the new python.org, I think in about a month. We'll see. However, there was an additional cost here. I should stress not to the PSF. We did this on a fixed bid basis. We did not take your money and use it to work on Python 3. But for us, there was an additional cost. We estimate this project probably cost about cost us about 20% more in terms of time. And actually, in terms of a little bit of money, we did pay a couple of people to sort of find the time to port things to Python 3. So we shelled out a little bit of money, but mostly in terms of time. I'll bet if we started now, that 20% number would be even lower, maybe 10%, 15%. So if you're a consultancy that has to really watch the bottom line, or if you're a business unit with limited resources, this 20% could be a deal breaker for you. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there still is an additional cost to Python 3. I think it's good that that cost isn't bigger. If it had been 50%, 80%, 100%, we probably would have scrapped it. But at the 10 to 20% range, I think it's worth it in terms of the payback in stability and in sort of ease of maintenance and sort of and pleasantness. That 20% upfront cost represents a savings on the back end of all those Unicode issues that show up in production once your site is live. So there's probably a cost savings over the lifespan of the project that's not quantifiable yet. So I think there's probably a legitimate business case to be made that starting with Python 3 is a pretty good thing to do, or at least a wash. But it's worth acknowledging that there is going to be an additional upfront expenditure in terms of time or resources to get a site written in Python 3. Okay, so the second case study I want to look at is porting a single app. We did a lot of these, and a lot of people in the community have been doing this over the last 6 months or so. And this is where the real effort is for porting your code, or porting sort of the community code. So the particular example I'm going to look at is an app called Django Site Tree that we used for this site. And actually, the work wasn't done by me. It was done by one of my colleagues, Jeff Triplett. And you can see the actual commit that ported the app to Python 3 at that link. And yes, I said commit. There was one. So that's going to give you a hint right off the bat that it's a reasonably small amount of work. This app, by the way, it's basically an app for managing a navigation tree on a website. It's sort of hierarchical navigation. You have a nav bar, and each bar has menus, and you can do submenus and stuff. And it's just a way of exposing that sort of thing through the admin. So not particularly complex, sort of a small component, but there's some complexity to it, and it was a little interesting. So step one was to choose an approach. We knew we wanted to use shared source. And based on what Site Tree already supported, we wanted to add Python 3 support, but not take away support for existing code. So what that meant was we wanted to support Python 2.6 or greater, so 2.6 and 2.7, and also Python 3.3. We decided we didn't need to support 3.1, 3.0, 3.1, or 3.2 because kind of nobody's using those yet. If you're using Python 3, you're probably using 3.3. And we decided we wanted to support Django 1.4. This is kind of interesting. Django 1.4 doesn't support Python 3. So we have a matrix where we support Python 2.6 and 2.7 on Django 1.4 and 1.5, and then Python 3 only with Django 1.5. So there's a sort of complicated build matrix right there. This is a reasonable minimum. If you're looking for what your support matrix should look like, this is probably the lowest you should go. If you try to support Python 1 or Django 1.3, it probably won't work because the utilities that I'm going to talk about aren't there yet. If you try to support Python 2.5, it probably won't work because of some syntax issues. Depending on where you are in terms of your community and how many people are using this app, you might want to consider just 2.7 and 3.3 and just Django 1.5 and/or just Django 1.5. If you do that, this will be very easy. Adding in 2.6 adds a little bit of extra work. Adding in 1.4 adds a little bit of extra work. So if you're looking for the easiest approach, 2.7, 3.3, 1.5 is your kind of easy baseline. But you can go back to 2.6 and 1.4 with not that much additional effort. We didn't have any dependencies. If your app does have dependencies, you kind of gotta unwind that dependency chain. This happened to me with one app. I sat down to try to port it, discovered it had unported dependencies. I ported those dependencies, and then I kind of never popped my stack, and that fell apart. I think I'm just going to go through and take questions after. Running tests. You should check out Tox. Tox basically lets you run tests under multiple environments, so it's a really perfect way to make sure that you're running tests against both Python 2.6, Python 2.7, Django 1.5, Django 1.4. And basically, you write a little file that looks like this. You specify your different environments, and Tox automates running tests against those different environments. So this is the best way to make sure that your tests pass under multiple different things. So then you have to iterate on syntax changes. The first set of failures you'll see from your test suite are going to be about syntax. And there's a couple of differences. The biggest one that you'll probably get bitten by is the damn print syntax changing. I still get this wrong. Print becomes a function. This is a good thing, but your muscle memory is print space, and you need to retrain it to print parenthesis, and that will be difficult, or at least it was for me. There are some other changes in the way you specify meta classes, the way exceptions are raised, the way exceptions are caught. They're all summed up in the What's New in Python 3 docs. These are reasonably easy. These can be done, almost be done by a trained monkey. They're just sort of syntactical changes. They're not particularly hard. You'll need to get them done even just to get your test suite running. At this point, your test suite will run, and now you'll be seeing lots of Unicode errors. So once again, Django utils encoding. You may have used this already in Python 2 to deal with Unicode issues. It does some kind of cool magic stuff to make sure that it does the right thing both on Python 2 and Python 3. And so this is where you'll find tools to encode to the default encoding, decode from the default encoding, et cetera, things along those lines. There's a little caveat about dealing with models and Unicode. In Python 3, the _Unicode method goes away and it gets renamed to str, which really should be text. But and so you can't. There's no way to write a model in plain vanilla syntax that supports both Python 2 and Python 3. So Django adds this decorator, this ugly class decorator, Python 2 Unicode compat. You write an str method, and if it's on Python 2, it magically changes it to be a Unicode method. So if you want to write code that works on both Python 2 and Python 3, you need this Unicode compat trick. So now we've got our Unicode stuff working. We've got our tests running. We've still got some failures. And at this point, I think we had maybe a half dozen or so failures left on this app. And all of those failures come down to differences between the way Python 2 and Python 3 does things. And for that, there's a package called 6, which also exists as Django utils 6, so that it's available whether or not you have working dependencies, whether or not Python has working dependencies. So 6 papers over stuff like there are different ways in Python 2 and in Python 3 of specifying meta classes. In Python 2, you say meta class equals m, in the __ syntax. In Python 3, you would say meta class equals. So there's no way to write code in both of these syntaxes. This doesn't work on Python 2, that doesn't work on Python 3. There's no way to reconcile it. 6 provides this 6.with meta class, which does the stuff that you want to do. Don't look at how this works, it's really scary. But it lets you write code that works on both Python 2 and Python 3, at the cost of being a little bit confusing. You guys need to sync your clocks. I'm going with Russ since he gives me more time. 6 gives you utils to paper over the fact that Python 2's str becomes called bytes, and then Unicode becomes called str, and then your head explodes. So 6 gives you binary type and text type to let you reason about types of things. And finally, there's like a little escape hatch, if 6.python3. If you really can't write code that works on both Python 2 and Python 3, there's this escape hatch. If I'm running a Python 3, do X. If I'm running a Python 2, do Y. There's a variety of other things in this 6 module that I'm not really going to go into depth on. This is just meant as a survey. But if you want more info, you can find it here at our porting to Python 3 documentation. We've got a guide about how to port your stuff to Python 3, written as we ported to Python 3 and updated as we started porting apps. And it's sort of your best place to start for more detailed documentation about how to move your stuff. So at PyCon a few years ago, somebody asked Guido, the creator of Python, basically for a status report on Python 3. And what Guido said was, so we put out Python 3, and then what happened was different people kind of had to port their stuff. And so we've entered this world where everyone kind of points at the person or the people who are holding up moving to Python 3, right? We all point, so for a while in the web world, we were all pointing at WSGI. We didn't have working WSGI for Python 3, so we couldn't do web stuff. And then that got fixed. And then we didn't have database drivers. We all pointed at the database driver people. And then that got fixed. And then everyone started pointing at frameworks, right? So we did it. We did our job. We ported to Python 3. And now I'm pointing at you. Now it's your turn. Now in order to move to Python 3, we need the third-party community to come along with us. We need Haystack working. We need TastyPie working. We need the Django HStore extensions working. We need all of these really awesome third-party packages that we rely on to get our job done. We need FindCMS. We need, goes on and on and on. The list is long. It's not that hard. Most of the time, these things take less than a week. Even if you're not the maintainer of one of these packages, you can probably have a pull request done by the end of PyCon AU. We've got some sprints here. There are people here who know how to do that. This is not an intractable problem. This is a supremely parallelizable problem. If we all focus on this problem for the next 3 to 6 months, most of the things we use are going to be ready for us on Python 3. We're there. It's now your turn, so please help me make this happen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jacob.